I won here too.
He's learned from Djokovic. He's learned from Nadal.
You want to be the best, you have to beat the best.
Question marks surrounding his reputation.
I am pretty sure that there are a lot of things we don't know.
Thousands paid to witness greatness. What they got was heartbreak. Alcaraz would finish his first Cincinnati match as champion in barely 23 minutes, and not one soul in that stadium cheered. The trophy went up in silence. Across the net, a broken rival sagged into his chair. The cruelest word of that night was withdraw. Now a tennis expert finally reveals why a man could win everything and still lose it all. The ache never healed. This week, it tore open again. Sinner abandoned Montreal without warning. Then, hours later, Djokovic was gone from the same draw. Alcaraz watches from the sidelines, his wrist shattered, his ranking bleeding 5,290 points behind his rival. These giants keep vanishing before our eyes. Fans who saved for months keep getting robbed of the war they craved. Go back to that suffocating 2025 afternoon. Sinner walked out unbeaten across 26 hard-court wins. His body surrendered at 5-love. Illness, they insisted. One analyst stared at the tape and felt the whole story crack apart. The numbers never added up. Subscribe before the truth slips away, because we say what polished broadcasts are terrified to admit. What surfaces next will break your heart a second time. That analyst was Ryan Harrison, a former Grand Slam doubles champion who now reads matches for a living, and the instant he leaned toward his microphone, the fear rippling through the arena found someone willing to name it. He rejected the obvious verdict. Almost everyone watching had already grabbed the word injury, picturing a torn muscle or a blown joint that would swallow the rest of Sinner's summer. Harrison heard a quieter diagnosis, and in some ways, a far stranger one. The world number one was sick, not damaged. A fever had crept into him the previous day, the sort of thing a champion tries to sleep off and wills into silence, so by the time he stepped under that merciless Ohio sun, the bug had already won the match nobody else could see. Recovery from a virus follows a kinder calendar than recovery from a tear, and that single distinction rewired the meaning of everything that had just unfolded. A man can crumble on Monday and stride out whole a fortnight later. Right there sits the reason Alcaraz could claim his first Cincinnati crown inside a graveyard hush, and yet feel the word withdraw shadowing every step of the achievement. The trophy in his hands was real. The route to it was the part no champion ever wants stapled to a resume. He had won a final that never became a contest, and the sport would spend weeks arguing about what that was worth. Peel back the 23 minutes themselves and the horror show comes into focus. Sinner dropped his opening service game without landing a meaningful blow, and the errors that followed carried none of the precision that had made him the most feared ball striker on the planet. 9 unforced mistakes leaked off his racket before the set was halfway done. Between points, he pressed a hand to his stomach, then draped an ice pack across the back of his neck during the changeover, hunting for any relief the heat would allow. His serve, usually a fortress, was breached 3 separate times without a single hold to show for the effort. A crowd that had paid premium money for a war watched a slow surrender instead. Conditions that afternoon would have tested a perfectly healthy athlete, let alone a feverish one. A 3 o'clock start under a punishing sun trapped heat and thick humidity across the court, sapping energy from every stride. Sinner's illness turned an already grueling environment into something closer to torture, and each exchange seemed to drain a little more life out of him. The elements did not cause his downfall, yet they hurried it along, stripping away whatever reserves might have let him fight through discomfort that a cooler day would have made bearable. He still tried to give the fans something, even as his body failed him. From the middle of the court, he apologized more than once, telling the stands he felt awful about disappointing people who had rearranged their Monday to be there, some sacrificing work and other obligations for a final that lasted barely longer than a warm-up. Sincerity poured out of the young Italian, and the crowd answered with sympathy rather than jeers, sensing that no competitor of his stature abandons a showpiece unless the situation has spiraled past his control. Seeing a proud champion apologize for something he could not prevent layered fresh melancholy onto an afternoon already drowning in it. History made the sight even rarer than it felt in the moment. Only 3 times had a Cincinnati men's final ended with a player unable to continue, and the previous instance stretched all the way back to 2011, when Novak Djokovic could not push through a shoulder problem. Sinner had walked in chasing a piece of the record books of his own, hoping to become the first man since Roger Federer a decade earlier to defend the Cincinnati title in consecutive years. A 26-match winning run on hard courts, the surface where he ruled without mercy, evaporated in less time than it takes to boil an egg. Dominance can vanish that quickly, and the tour had just been handed a violent reminder. Across the net, the eventual champion had sensed the wrongness long before the doctor was summoned. Alcaraz later admitted that around the 3rd game, something felt off, that the mistakes flying from his rival's strings looked bizarre for a competitor of that caliber. He kept his own level high, wary that the whole thing might be a trap, half expecting the real Sinner to surge back into the picture. That surge never arrived. What Alcaraz felt instead was the creeping awareness that he was about to be gifted a moment he had dreamed of since boyhood, wrapped in circumstances that drained the joy clean out of it. When the handshake came, the young Spaniard offered comfort rather than celebration. He told Sinner directly that this was not how he wanted to lift trophies, that he understood the pain of surrendering a showpiece in front of a full house, and that his friend would return stronger. Moments later, he crouched by the courtside camera and scrawled a 2-word apology across the lens, aiming it at the man he had just defeated. The gesture said more than any speech could. Their rivalry had already produced some of the greatest tennis of the modern era, yet the bond underneath it kept refusing to curdle into bitterness. So the ceremony unfolded like a wake with a winner. Confetti had no business falling on a scene this deflated, and Alcaraz accepted his silverware with the muted expression of someone who knew the asterisk would travel with the title forever. He had finished his first Cincinnati campaign as its champion, a sentence that should sparkle, and yet the defining verb of the day belonged to his opponent. Withdrawal, not triumph, ran along the bottom of every broadcast. The paradox baked into that Monday would outlive the trophy engraving, because a crown earned through another man's illness always carries a shadow. None of that gloom erased what the Spaniard had built across the year. His Cincinnati victory represented a 6th title of a scorching 2025, another Masters 1000 shield to hang beside a swelling collection, and further proof that he had matured into the most complete force in the game. Months of bending matches to his will with a blend of power, touch, and sheer audacity had left rivals scrambling for answers nobody could find. Claiming an 8th career Masters crown ought to have sparked unfiltered joy. Yet the circumstances demanded restraint, and he wore that restraint with a poise well beyond his age. The shadow lengthened before anyone had time to catch a breath. Within a day, Sinner and his partner, Katerina Siniakova, pulled out of the reinvented US Open mixed doubles event, an exhibition-flavored spectacle carrying a staggering $1 million prize for the champions. The illness that had felled him in Ohio simply refused to release its grip in time. His name disappeared from a marquee field that organizers had assembled specifically to lure the sport's biggest draws under the New York lights, and the tournament absorbed the loss of its shiniest attraction. Alcaraz, meanwhile, went the opposite direction entirely. He entered that same mixed doubles circus alongside Emma Raducanu, a pairing engineered for maximum wattage, and the draw slotted them against Jack Draper and Jessica Pegula. One half of the great rivalry pressed forward into extra competition, while the other retreated to a doctor's office. That contrast is the quiet engine of the entire headline. A champion who could finish his tournament and keep chasing more, set against a fallen number 1 dragged repeatedly toward the same joyless word until the two storylines felt permanently intertwined. Organizers had gambled on star power to legitimize their reinvented mixed doubles concept, so losing the reigning men's number 1 punctured the very spectacle they had marketed so aggressively. Detractors of the revamped format pounced on the exit as proof that cramming exhausted singles stars into an extra competition invited exactly this kind of collapse. A 7-figure carrot could not override a body screaming for rest, and the whole experiment absorbed an early bruise to its credibility before the main event had even begun. Underneath the human drama, a colder arithmetic was already reshaping the season. The full 1,000 ranking points from the Cincinnati title landed in Alcaraz's column, and the gap that Sinner had spent months protecting at the summit of the standings suddenly looked far more fragile. A rivalry measured in Grand Slam trophies was, for one crucial stretch, going to be settled by a spreadsheet. The Spaniard had clawed his way back into striking distance of the top ranking, and the timing could not have been more loaded because the calendar was about to hand him an enormous opportunity. The math tilted even further once the US Open loomed into view. Sinner arrived in New York defending a mountain of 2,000 points, the reward for lifting the trophy there 12 months earlier. Alcaraz walked in with almost nothing to protect, since his 2024 visit to Flushing Meadows had ended with a stunning second-round exit against Botic van de Zandschulp. One man had everything to lose and the other had everything to gain, a lopsided setup that meant any deep run by the challenger or any stumble by the champion would flip the balance of power at the top. Every neutral could feel the collision coming. Two players who had already carved 2025 into their own private duel were sprinting toward a hard-court reckoning where the world #1 ranking itself sat on the table. The withdrawal in Cincinnati had not ended their argument. It had merely loaded the next chapter with higher stakes, turning a routine slam into a referendum on who truly owned the era. Anticipation of that magnitude does not build around ordinary sport, and everybody sensed the fuse burning down toward September. New York delivered on the promise, though not in the marathon style their earlier meetings had made famous. Alcaraz dismantled Sinner across 4 sets, taking the final by a scoreline of 6-2, 3-6, 6-1, 6-4, seizing the 6th Grand Slam title of his young career. The #1 ranking changed hands in the same breath, wrestled away from an Italian who had held it with such authority for so long. A season that started with the pair trading blows across surfaces ended with the Spaniard back on the throne, and the trophy that mattered most had gone to the player nobody could rattle when the lights burned brightest. The trophy ceremony captured the peculiar warmth of their feud. Alcaraz joked that he was seeing his rival more often than his own family, drawing a grin from the Italian who had just swallowed another painful defeat. Real affection ran between two men separated by the thinnest of margins on court, and that closeness only sharpened the drama, because every clash felt like a duel between brothers rather than enemies. Tennis had rarely been blessed with a rivalry this ferocious and this generous in the very same breath. That triumph completed something no two men had ever managed inside a single campaign. Alcaraz and Sinner became the first pair in the sport's history to face each other in 3 consecutive Grand Slam finals in the same year, a sequence that ran from the red clay of Roland Garros through the lawns of Wimbledon and into the concrete of Flushing Meadows. The Spaniard had survived match points to steal Paris across 5.5 brutal hours. The Italian had answered on grass in London, and the decider in America tipped the ledger back toward the man from Murcia. Each leg of that trilogy had carried its own private torment. In Paris, the Spaniard had crawled out of a grave, erasing 3 championship points before outlasting Sinner across the longest final Roland Garros had ever staged, an epic that stretched beyond 5.5 hours. The Italian exacted his revenge on the London grass, denying Alcaraz a 3rd straight Wimbledon and claiming the trophy he had craved most of all. New York then served as the tiebreaker to a season-long conversation, and the man who answered loudest strolled away with both the silverware and the crown that came attached to it. Their rivalry had become the axis the whole tour rotated around. Trace the through line and the Cincinnati non-final stops looking like a footnote and starts looking like a prophecy. A 23-minute collapse foreshadowed the handover of the crown, a warning that even a body as machine-like as Sinner's carried a breaking point. The illness that emptied a Monday in Ohio bled directly into the ranking swing that crowned a champion in New York. What seemed at first like a cruel accident revealed itself as the hinge on which an entire year turned, which is precisely why one sharp analyst kept insisting it deserved far more scrutiny than a shrug and a get-well card. The story refused to stay in 2025, and that is where the picture darkens all over again. Sinner regathered himself with frightening speed, reclaiming the world #1 ranking in the spring of 2026 and reasserting the control that had briefly slipped from his grasp. He assembled a run on the biggest stages that most players could only fantasize about, stitching together a streak of Masters 1000 crowns that peaked with a triumph on home clay at the Italian Open, a result that carved his name deeper into the record books. The kid who had been carried off in Cincinnati had transformed back into the sport's remorseless standard-bearer. The scale of that surge bordered on the absurd. Suffocation became his signature, and draws that once coughed up regular upsets suddenly produced nothing but orderly marches toward the trophy. Opponents arrived on court already half-beaten, worn thin by the aura of a man who barely conceded a set. That fever which emptied a Cincinnati Monday felt like ancient folklore against a backdrop of such relentless supremacy. Wimbledon soon added another jewel. Sinner defended his grass court title in the summer of 2026, outlasting Alexander Zverev across a tense four-set final to capture his 5th major overall and the 30th trophy of his career. The championships that had once slipped through his fingers now belonged to him twice in a row, and the victory reinforced a sense that the Italian had entered a phase of ruthless consistency. Whatever the fever in Ohio had suggested about mortality, the man had spent the following year answering it with silverware. Zverev's presence in that final marked a shift of its own. The German had finally broken his Grand Slam duck at Roland Garros earlier in 2026, ending years of near misses and heartbreak by claiming a maiden major on the Paris clay. His run to the Wimbledon final pushed him up to number 2 in the world, disrupting the two-man monopoly that Sinner and Alcaraz had enjoyed for so long. A rivalry that many assumed would define the decade suddenly had a third heavyweight muscling into the frame, and the hierarchy at the top grew more crowded than it had been in years. Pundits wasted no time debating whether a fresh trio had formed at the summit. Some insisted that Zverev, Sinner, and Alcaraz would carve up the sport for years to come, casting the German as the third pillar of a new establishment. Skeptics fired back that grass had never flattered Zverev, and that his breakthrough owed as much to Alcaraz's absence as to any leap in his own game. The argument raged without resolution, though its mere existence proved how dramatically the landscape had tilted since that silent Cincinnati Monday. For Alcaraz, the same stretch curdled into something painful. He had opened 2026 in glory, lifting the Australian Open in January and looking every inch the man to beat. Then his body betrayed him. A wrist injury dragged him out of the sport for months, forcing an agonizing absence that swallowed both Roland Garros and Wimbledon, the two majors where his flair had so often dazzled. The champion who could not celebrate in Cincinnati found himself grounded entirely, watching from the sidelines as his rivals divided the year's grandest prizes between them. The consequences showed up brutally in the rankings. Alcaraz tumbled from the summit down to 3rd in the world, overtaken by both Sinner and the surging Zverev, while he rehabilitated in silence. The deficit between the Spaniard and the man at the top ballooned past 5,000 points, a chasm so wide that closing it would demand months of flawless tennis even after a full return to fitness. The player who had wrested the #1 ranking away in New York a year earlier now stared up at a mountain that seemed to grow taller with every tournament he missed. History does offer him a sliver of hope. Back in 2022, an abdominal injury suffered at the Paris Masters had wrecked the end of his season, sidelining him for a stretch roughly as long as the one his wrist has now imposed. He returned in Buenos Aires the following February, seized the title almost immediately, then powered to the final in Rio before Cameron Norrie edged him out. A lengthy layoff had failed to dull his edge on that occasion, and his camp clings to the belief that lightning might strike a second time. Whether a wrist behaves like an abdomen under the strain of live competition remains the great unknown. Supporters of the Spaniard have spent the layoff swinging between dread and yearning. They ache for the flair that lights up arenas, the drop shots and the outrageous angles that turn matches into theater. Yet they fear a rushed comeback could deepen the damage and cost him even more of his prime. Patience wrestles with hunger inside everyone who has followed his ascent. The sport simply glows less brightly without him, and the countdown to his return carries an emotional weight that cold rankings could never measure. The eeriest twist arrived courtesy of Sinner himself. During his 2026 clay campaign, the Italian suffered a second-round exit at the French Open, felled once more by illness after feeling unwell and dizzy in the middle of the contest. He later spoke about overhauling his physical workload, hunting for answers about why his engine occasionally sputtered on the sport's biggest days. The parallel to that Cincinnati Monday was impossible to ignore. A body capable of superhuman dominance kept revealing a fault line, an unpredictable vulnerability that surfaced without warning and reshaped tournaments in an instant. Which brings the whole saga crashing into the present because the same unsettling pattern erupted again just days ago. Sinner withdrew from the National Bank Open, the Masters 1000 event staged this year in Montreal, prioritizing his health with the US Open charging over the horizon. Novak Djokovic pulled out of the identical tournament almost in lockstep, and commentators branded the double departure a disaster for an event stripped of its headline acts. Alcaraz was nowhere near the entry list either, his wrist still keeping him idle, while Greg Rusedski warned that the Spaniard faces a genuine fitness examination before he can contend in New York again. Organizers in Montreal could barely mask their frustration. A field built around Sinner and Djokovic had shed both marquee names within hours, and observers revived a long-simmering complaint about the bloated schedule that now stretches these Masters events across nearly a fortnight. Players grumble that dragging tournaments out to 12 days grinds bodies down and invites precisely the late withdrawals that gut the ticket-buying public. The economics of the modern tour had collided head-on with the physical limits of the athletes powering it, and nobody left the argument satisfied. Djokovic's involvement threaded a poetic wrinkle through the whole affair. The last man before Sinner to abandon a Cincinnati final had been Djokovic himself in 2011, and here he was skipping the Canadian stop entirely as he nurses an aging frame through the twilight of a staggering career. A generation that once looked permanent keeps ceding ground to fragility, and even the sport's greatest survivor now chooses his battles with visible caution. Time spares nobody, not even the man who rewrote every record worth holding. Stack those absences beside the Cincinnati collapse, and the emotional gut punch lands with real force. The very best players in the world keep vanishing from the biggest stages. Sometimes a virus is the culprit. On other occasions, a wary team pulls the plug purely as a precaution. Worst of all, a serious injury can swallow an entire season in one cruel stroke. No shadowy conspiracy lurks behind it, whatever the drama of the moment might tempt a fan to believe. What the evidence actually exposes is more sobering than any plot. The physical cost of ruling modern tennis has climbed so high that even generational talents crack under the load, and the schedule shows no mercy to the bodies grinding through it. Voices across the game have grown louder about that toll. Lengthening seasons, mandatory events, punishing travel, and surfaces that hammer joints have combined to turn durability into the rarest currency in tennis. Champions who survive intact tend to hoist the grandest prizes, while those whose bodies betray them at the cruelest moment watch history unfold from a treatment table. Such a reality lends the Cincinnati retirement a meaning far larger than one lost final, framing it as an early symptom of a strain the entire circuit keeps failing to solve. That truth is exactly what Ryan Harrison glimpsed when he refused to reduce a 23-minute retirement to bad luck. He understood that the difference between illness and injury would decide whether Sinner's summer survived, and he understood that a champion collapsing in 1 week says nothing about his ceiling the next. His read proved prophetic because the Italian rebuilt himself into a world beater within months. Yet the deeper lesson lingered. Greatness at this altitude is astonishingly fragile, and a single fever can rearrange the entire order of a season. So the headline finally makes complete sense. Alcaraz could finish his first Cincinnati match as a champion and still have the word "withdraw" branded onto the memory, because the crown and the collapse were the same event viewed from opposite sides of the net. His victory exists forever beside his rival's surrender, one impossible without the other. The trophy is legitimate, the achievement is real, and the shadow is permanent. A first title in a beloved tournament will always carry the ghost of the man who could not finish, and no amount of engraving can scrub that ghost away. Look closely and the paradox stops feeling like a trick of language. Sport keeps generating outcomes that resist tidy labels. moments where triumph and misfortune share a single frame, and neither one cancels the other. Alcaraz owns a Cincinnati title, Sinner owns the reason it rang hollow, and both truths sit comfortably side by side without contradiction. The record book will show a champion, the memory will whisper about a surrender, and any honest witness has to hold the two at once. Everything now points toward another chapter written under the New York lights. Sinner returns resurgent, determined to guard his throne. Hunger radiates off Zverev, who would relish nothing more than gatecrashing a party that once welcomed only two hosts. Alcaraz, wounded and uncertain, must prove his body can still carry his genius. The fragility that surfaced on that scorching Cincinnati afternoon has become the defining theme of the era, a quiet reminder that the players who look invincible are anything but. Whatever comes next, that strange, silent Monday will keep echoing through every result these champions produce. If this untangled the mystery for you, do the channel a real favor before you go. Hit that subscribe button, ring the notification bell so you never miss the next deep dive, and drop your verdict in the comments because I want to know whether you think that Cincinnati crown deserves an asterisk or the full respect of a title fairly won. Share this with the one friend who still argues about it, and stick around because the road to the US Open is about to get far messier than anyone at the top is ready to admit.